How to make a knife. I had been wanting to make a knife for one of my good friends who does Civil War reenacting, and now that he and his wife are expecting a baby girl, I thought he needed something to help scare away the boys. I designed this after what I have seen called frontier-style knives because I felt like it fit the time period well, but you can hopefully use this Instructable to design any knife style or shape of your choosing. I have been making knives as a hobby for a little while, but just recently got involved with Instructables, so I figured it would be good to show my take on making knives. Step 1. Determine the shape of the knife. For some of my knives I have templates that I already made, but sometime I will just wing it if I'm making a new design. I used 1/8 in 01 tool steel because that is what I had on hand. I already had some rectangular blanks cut, so I had to determine what size I wanted to use for this knife. I used a cardboard template to transfer the design onto the steel. Step 2. Cut the blank to shape. Now that I had the shape determined, it was time to cut out the basic knife shape. I used a hacksaw while the blank was clamped in place to cut out the rough shape. I then cleaned up the shape on my 2x72 belt grinder I just made. This was the first knife I made since I upgraded from a 4x36 belt sander, and I have to say it is a huge improvement. Step 3. Hammer finish. For this knife, I wanted it to have that forged hammered look, so I used a chunk of steel as an anvil and then hit it a ton with a ball-peen hammer. I should have realized it was a bad idea to mount my phone on the same bench I was hammering on. Step 4. Initial bevel. Now that the shape is where you want it, it is time to put the rough bevel on the blade. Before you will begin, you will want to mark the center line. You can do this by marking the blade edge with a Sharpie and then use a drill bit the same thickness as your blade to run along the edge to scratch in a center line. I couldn't get a good picture of this with my phone, so unfortunate I can't show the line on the blade. Now that you have the center line, you can proceed with grinding the bevel. Tip 1. I ground this bevel freehand, but there are many jigs that you can make if you want a consistent bevel or don't want to try freehand. I usually use a jig, but I want to do more freehand to get better at it. Tip 2. Do not grind the bevel too close to the center, as it can warp during heat treat. You want a penny's thickness of material left before heat treat. Step 5. Finalizing the shape. So, although I liked the shape, but then I changed my mind. As long as you are removing material, you can always alter your design as you go along. Tip: if you use a Dremel like me for grinding to shape, then I'd recommend getting those cheap lots of sanding drums rather than the Dremel brand ones. The off-brand ones won't last as long, but you will get considerably more. In the long run, it is a better price for the amount of grinding you will do. Step 6. Making the handle scales. Now that the knife is shaped, it is time to make the scales that will be the handles. I made these scales out of walnut because I wanted to use an American wood, because I figured that is what would have been available back in mid-1800s. I cut the piece in half to make 2 matching scales. Once they were made, I then drilled the holes in the blade and then used those holes as guides to drill the holes in one of the scales. I used 2 other drill bits to keep the 2 pieces aligned. I then used 1 scale as a template for the holes in the second one. Tip 1. If you do not have the resources to make your own scales, then you can always buy them from any knife making site or even eBay. Step 7. Profile the handle. With the scales made and drilled, it was now time to profile them to match the shape of the knife. Tip: many people only shape the front end of the scales until they are assembled onto the knife, but I did it this way because I planned on etching the blade and did not want to remove the etch coloring. when shaping the handles. Doing it this way can be more difficult, but I needed to do it to achieve the look I was going for. To shape these, I first added 2 pins through all 3 parts to keep them aligned, and then roughed out the shape, leaving a small gap before I reached the metal. I then switched to a lower grit belt and finished shaping it down to the metal. I also used my Dremel to reach the small radius that my belt grinder could not. I then sanded it down to 300 grit, as once they are removed from the blade I cannot sand those edges, or it would end up being smaller than the blade underneath. Step 8. Shape and finish the handle. Now that the outside shape was made, it was time to finalize the handle shape. I sanded both scales down to the thickness that I wanted, and then used 2 smaller pins to hold them together to shape the front. Then all that was left was to hand sand them down to the desired shape and apply your desired finish. Step 9. Heat treat and temper. Now it's time to harden the blade. I used a small forge I built when I started making knives. It doesn't retain heat well because it is too large for the heat source, but I can still get a good heat treat with it. Then it's off to the oven for tempering. Tip 1. For 01 tool steel, you will want to heat up the blade until it is not magnetic 1500 degrees F. Just check it with a magnet until it no longer is attracted to the steel, and you will want to let it soak at that temperature for about 15 minutes. I've never timed it, but make it close. I quench mine in plain old canola oil that has been heated to around 125 degrees. Then for the temper, this makes it so it isn't as brittle. I would recommend 2 sets of 2 hours at 400 degrees, letting it completely cool between sets. If the heat treat is good, then a file will glide across the blade without biting into the material. Step 10. 01 tool steel blade testing. I'm including this step in here for anyone who would like to know more about how well 01 steel holds up as a blade. The first knife I made had too small of a handle, so I decided it would make a good test knife to see just how good my heat treat was and how good the steel was. I know my heat treat isn't the most precise, so even if yours isn't either, you can expect similar results. Tests. Hardness, I got around 59-60 HRC for the blade. Due to this being my first heat treat, the tip didn't get as hard as it should have. Tip retention, I had a 2x2 that I jammed the tip into and then continually pried it out. The tip was not damaged. Chop test, I chapped my way through an entire 2x2. Cutting paper showed it was close to, if not just as sharp as before testing. Batten test, I hammered it through a couple dried logs, and then hammered it through a 2x2 against the grain. Blade did not crack, and I hit it hard to get it through. Nail and bolt cut, I knew this would damage the blade, but was curious how much. Cut through a nail, not problem, but did damage the blade. Cut about halfway through a small bolt, but did a good amount of damage to the blade. Bend test, I needed to find a way to break this, so I figured bending it would do the trick. The handle finally bent, and then after I could get more leverage on it, I got the blade to snap. If the handle bends that much before the blade breaks, then you're not using the knife right. Overall, I was happy with the results of this test, as it showed it could take a lot of abuse and hold up well. Hope this is helpful to anyone using 01 steel for knives. Step 11. Finalize the bevels. Now that it is heat treated, it was time to grind it down to the thickness you want. Tip: if you don't grind it down far enough, then it just means you will have to do more sharpening. And let me tell you, it can mean the difference of a 1-hour sharpening job to a 3-4-hour sharpening job. Step 12. Etch the blade. I wanted the blade to be a dark grey color, so I etched it in ferric chloride. I used nail polish to protect the edge of the blade while it was being etched. I then cleaned it off with acetone to remove any grease from my hand or anything that would affect the etch. Then add the ferric chloride and water to a plastic or glass container and wait for it to etch. After it was removed from the etch, I scrubbed it with some 0000 steel wool to clean off any residue and then ground the bevels again to expose the shiny steel again. I wanted the contrasting color of a dark blade with a shiny bevel. You will want to dilute the ferric chloride before using it, and I would recommend checking it every 5 to 10 minutes until it reaches the darkness you desire. I used a 1 part ferric chloride to 2 parts water mix. If you use hot water, it can speed up the etch. If you clean it off and it isn't as dark as you want, then put it back in again. It can build up scale, which will slow the etch. Step 13. Glue it together. It is now ready to be assembled. I used T88 epoxy for this and then glued the handles to the blade with the pins in place. I used 1/8 in 360 brass for my pins. It helps to make cavities between the handle and blade for the epoxy to fill. I used a Dremel and scored some X's into the blade, but you could also drill some additional holes that would make room for the epoxy. Step 14. Smoothing down the pins. Now that it is all glued up, it is time to trim the pins down. I used a hacksaw to cut the pin down closer to the handle and then used the belt grinder to sand them down until they just barely stuck out. I would usually sand them down all the way, but because of the look I was going for, I decided to use my ball-peen hammer and hammer them the rest of the way flat. This resulted in a hammered pin look, which gives it that older style look. You can use nicer looking mosaic pins, but you cannot hammer these. They will have to be ground flat if you use them. Step 15. Making the leather handle wrap. One of the things that I saw on knives of this style was a small piece of leather that wrapped around the front of the handle where your index finger would rest. I thought this looked cool and had the leather, so I figured why not add it. I used some 4-4.5 Oz leather that I had. If you are buying leather for this, I might recommend getting something a little bit thinner than that, but it ended up working fine. I cut it to the width I wanted, then taped it in place so that I could mark where to cut. After cutting, it was then just time to stitch it up. I chose to do X-pattern, but you could do whatever you want. Step 16. Sharpening. All that is left to finish the knife is sharpen it. I used the Lansky sharpening system. I don't know how it compares to others out there, but it was pretty cheap and it gets my knives shaving sharp. Step 17. Make the sheath. Because I am sending this to a friend and really want to finish the complete look of the knife, I decided to make a sheath for the knife. I used some thicker leather that I had. I believe this was 5 to 6 Oz thick. The label didn't say. To make this, you will want to fold the leather over your knife however you want it and then trace the edge of the knife, making sure to leave a small gap from where you plan on cutting. This leaves room for the stitching. I used a leather punch to make the holes for this as the leather was thicker, and then I stitched it up. I forgot to take more pictures to show how I did the stitch, but I started at the top and stitched one side, making sure to leave room for the other stitches. I then mirrored the pattern I did on the other side, and when I reached the bottom I tied it off. This didn't hold as well as I thought, so I took the 2 remaining strands and worked them back up, going in and out along the side of the previous stitch. I then tied them off at the top, and it ended up looking really good. If this is confusing for anyone and you would like more details on it, let me know and I can try and make a sketch to explain it better. Step 18. Enjoy your knife. Your knife is now complete. All that is left is to go and enjoy the knife that you got to make. Just make sure that if you are not using a stainless steel that you will need to keep it from rusting. I use Burt's Bees Lip Balm because I already had it, and it's a natural beeswax that is food safe while providing a barrier to keep out moisture. A lot of waxes and oils work great for protecting the blade, and don't leave it in a high moisture environment if you can help it.